Hey, well, good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you guys today. Um, I hope things are going well for you as we finish the month of March and we're now starting the month of April. I've gone ahead and uploaded a document for our viewing today. Thank you all for your wishes. Today is the 1st of April, and I'm very glad to spend it with you guys. Um, I did send a document out called What Hath God Wrought, which is kind of a weird document and weird title. And we're going to actually look at that document today. And that's what we're going to be going over. It continues with our theme of the Industrial Revolution, and it's going to pick up on one part of that theme in particular. So if you haven't done so, you can make sure that you look at our website and get the document called What Hath God Wrought? So many of you are logging on now and with us now, and I appreciate all of the birthday wishes. Today is April 1st, which turns out to be my birthday, and I'm glad I get to spend it with you guys in this first part of the day. So, one of the things I wanted to go ahead and talk to you guys about with this theme that we've been looking at of the Industrial Revolution. And I wanted to talk to you guys about one part of the Industrial Revolution today, which has to do with communication. This one part of the Industrial Revolution I wanted to talk with you guys about today has to do with communication. And it's kind of a funny title of our document, which is called What Hath God Wrought? Which means like, what has God made? What has God put forward? And that is actually the first text message ever sent through the telegraph. If you think about like the first text message that you sent, do you think that people would be studying that 100 years, 150 years later? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. The very first messages, the first form of text messages that were sent in the form of the telegraph. And so on our handout, it tells us that television, that the telephone, that the radio, that the TV, and even the internet are all based off a piece of 19th century technology, and that's the telegraph. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning, is the role that the telegraph played. And so TV, radio, even the internet is based on this 19th century piece of technology, the telegraph. And the thing about the telegraph that makes it so important is that for the first time, the telegraph separated the person from the message. For the very first time, the telegraph separated the person from the message. What we mean by that is that all the way up to this time, the only way that you could ever get a message, the only way that you could ever get a letter or some sort of communication was by someone walking the message to you, by someone getting on a horse and writing the message to you, or even, that's great that we have trains and stuff like that. We'll be talking about the role of trains, but now I don't even have to wait for a bag of mail to be put on a train with steam power to get it for me. Now with the telegraph, we're sending messages across the country with an electronic pulse. It's going to be going pretty much at the speed of light across the United States, across the world. For the first time, the telegraph, it separated the person from the message. It says next that prior to this point, messages could only move as fast as the messenger. Prior to this point, messages could only move as fast as the messenger. And so that's an incredible development that has occurred. And it says that this is yet another example of a revolution in the 19th century. We've talked about the political revolutions with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Creole revolutions in South America, in Latin America more broadly. We started talking about yesterday about the Industrial Revolution, but there's yet another subset of revolution in the Industrial Revolution, it says this was a revolution of communication. This is a revolution of communication. That's what we're going to be seeing in today's time, focusing in on the telegraph. That not only do we have in the 18th century, the 19th century, political revolutions, not only do we have an industrial revolution, but we also have a revolution in communication. So let's kind of compare the telegraph to other forms of communication that had happened before. Now, for sure, we have the Pony Express, we have people carrying letters through horseback or in person. That's great, and that's all wonderful. However, the railroad, which we kind of just barely started talking about yesterday, we'll continue to talk about in the next few days. The railroad helped communication incredibly. In fact, looking at your handout, it says the railroad carried communication 10 to 15 times faster than what came before. That the railroad carried communication 10 to 15 times faster than before. And so the railroad is for sure an improvement. I mean, if I am depending on, just people carrying stuff by wagon train, they would get these wagons and fill it up with mail. And, that's the kind of communication I have across the United States, across Russia, across the world. Wagon train. Well, the actual steam engine train was 10 to 15 times faster than that. But what about the telegraph? What about this cable that I'm connecting one city to the next, and then I'm sitting at a terminal and I'm using Morse code and electronic pulse that's going to go across these wires? How much faster is the telegraph than a train? Well, we're going to write down that the telegraph carried communication 40 million times faster. That it carried communication 40 million times faster. I mean, think about the age of revolution that is. I mean, you and I mean, there's some pretty revolutionary things we're experiencing right now. In April 1st, 2020, we're in the middle of this global pandemic. We're in a world that has been shut down, and we have overcome some of those challenges by using the internet. We've overcome some of those challenges by meeting online. People are on Zoom. People are on YouTube. People are on FaceTime. We're using the internet to connect in ways that frankly, earlier in my life, I would not think possible. That definitely our parents, our grandparents would not have fully appreciated the possibility of it. That's revolutionary in many ways. If this pandemic would have happened 10 years ago, would we have had class online like we're having now? I would say probably not. Probably not. But think about revolution that happened in the 1800s, where to be waiting for news that could take weeks or months, or in some cases, perhaps even years to get from me sending it to get to India for them to read it and then respond back. But now it says on our handout, the telegraph carried communication 40 million times faster than a train. There's a quotation on your handout, just to give you an example of the speed that we're talking about. It says on your handout, it was said that, quote, a single dot of Morse code traveled from Kansas City to Denver faster than the sound of the click it produced from the telegrapher's eardrum. In other words, if you're using Morse code, you have this device and you're kind of like tapping out this device. But the thing about messages, these text messages that we're basically sending through the telegraph, that it's basically moving at the speed of light. These electronic pulses are basically moving at the speed of light. And so as I'm sitting and I'm sending out these text messages, there's like a little noise that's being sent out as I'm sending this message. The text message I'm sending out on the telegraph is moving faster from me using it to going to Denver, going to India, going to wherever it is going. It's traveling faster to India, faster to Denver than the sound of the actual telegraph going from my fingertip to my eardrum. I mean, that's an amazing thing. And that is the kind of communication we still, to a certain degree, enjoy today. Last night, I was talking with my friend from Rwanda. He had like this nightmare. It was like 3 a.m. there. It was like 7 o'clock p.m. here, or maybe 8 o'clock p.m. here in Houston. And he texted me. He's like, "Oh, I just had a nightmare that, we were by a river and you actually drowned, and I was trying to save you, but I couldn't. Are you okay?" This is my friend in Rwanda had a nightmare that I died, and he texted me, and I was able to like send him a picture of me and my daughter and me and my family in our living room, say, "Hey, I'm okay. Everything's no problem." It was instantaneous communication we had. And we sometimes think, oh, we're the first generation to do this. But at this time, people are communicating so quickly, for millions of times faster, 40 million times faster than before. It says on the handout, in 1844, there was only 44 miles of wire connecting the United States. In 1844, there was only 44 miles of wire connecting the United States. This first telegraph line was connecting Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, just north of our nation's capital. And this was really like the test line. These 44 miles of line was really just the test line to see, is this telegraph system going to even work? And it did work. As we are experiencing this really a revolution of communication, we're going to see that it goes from a simple 44 miles of wire to, if you look at your handout, by 1870, there was 120,000 miles of wire. And that's just in the United States. That doesn't even include the rest of the world. We go from 44 miles to 120,000 miles of wire in the US. In fact, it goes even beyond that. It says on your handout, by the end of the 19th century, cables were laid on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And so we want to not just connect with the United States, but we even go to another step where we're actually taking cable on boats and laying it. We're unrolling it off the side of boats. It's going to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And we're going to see in the end of the 19th century that all across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean are cables, physical cables that are now physically connecting New York to London. We are now connecting all across the globe with these underwater cables. It's an amazing thing that happens. It says, by the end of the 19th century, cables were laid at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, connecting America to Europe and the rest of the world. We're connecting America to Europe and to the rest of the world. And so, we have these actual physical cables that are laid on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It's an amazing and a wonderful accomplishment. In 1844, the very first message that was texted out, the very first message that was telegraphed out is this weird message. It was the words, "What hath God wrought?" And it was the first message sent from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. We'll talk a little bit more about what is that weird message. Why would that be your first text message that you would ever send, that you'd ever telegraph out? What hath God wrought? We'll kind of return to that in the end of our time this morning. But we go from a single message sent in 1844 to, by the end of the 1800s, we'll write down that there were 32 million messages a year. That there was 32 million messages sent every single year. And so what a huge increase that is, that we go from one message in 1844 to 32 million messages being telegraphed out every year. And, even think about how that communication has increased in our own life, where we used to pay perhaps, X amount of cents per text message, that you'd be sending you'd be charged so many cents per text message. Now, most of us have unlimited text. We can just text as many, how many messages do you send in a day? How many do you send in a week or a month? Well, all that communication revolution actually begins here in the 1800s, with people being able to send hundreds, thousands of messages. By the end, we're having 32 million messages sent a year. It says that cities like Berlin, like Calcutta, Tokyo, San Francisco, Houston, and New York were all connected. That's a huge change. I mean, it used to be like, I live in Houston, Texas, you live in New York. It's going to be weeks, it's going to be months of waiting for any sort of meaningful interaction or communication, much less if you have moved from Italy. We talked about, as Italy became united, that thousands and thousands of Italians left Italy. They came to the United States. I mean, what kind of turnaround time are we going to be waiting for that to happen? It says now all these cities, not just European cities, Japanese cities like Tokyo, Indian cities like Calcutta, the entire planet is now connected by these copper wires, these telegraph lines. All the world is connected. And communicating through telegraph was perfected by a man named Samuel Morse. You probably have heard of Morse code. We get Morse code from Samuel Morse, and he was a Yale-educated landscape artist. That was actually his first thing that he ever did, was that he was an artist. He was a painter, and then later on in his life, he transitions from being this painter to being a person who's kind of thinking about, how can I perfect communication on the telegraph? So Samuel Morse, this Yale-educated landscape artist, turned his attention to perfecting a method to communicate on the telegraph. And what he comes up with was that there's a super simple way to do that. And on your document, on your handout, you have a chart of Morse code. And so Morse code is just basically a very setup. Every letter represented by a dash or a dot, a very simple electronic pulse. That's like a simple pulse, an immediate pulse. Like, for example, the letter E, if you look at that, it's just one simple pulse. It's an E. It's a dot. But if I wanted to do the letter A, it's a dot followed by a dash. And so this international Morse code, it is a way. It doesn't matter if you speak French and I speak English. It doesn't matter if you speak Russian or German or Italian. This very simple method, the Morse code, is perfected, and it's used so that people then who were these telegraphers, these guys who had the job of doing it, they could now communicate, as fast as you and I are talking. Just like, a lot of you guys can text without even looking at what you're doing, just like instinct. I mean, like, your thumbs are going to fall off later on in your midlife, because you're just so used to it. You're so good at it, right? In the same way, people were so good at telegraphy that they were able to send these messages just like you and I are talking. So the Morse code is how we do that. And there is a physical need. Now that we have this technology, there's a physical need to set up a network of communication, a physical network. And so, outside of our homes and our neighborhoods, we have, some of us, we could see telephone wires. We have internet cables that physically come into our house. Well, before internet cables, before any of that, we need to have telegraph lines. And these telegraph lines are going to be, strung all across the United States. These physical cables on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Morse code will be used, and it doesn't matter what language that you use, because it's just a symbol of it's an international system that will be used all around the world. So it says that the first company who's going to be able to do this, it says in the handout, Western Union would build a transcontinental line. That it would be Western Union who would help build a transcontinental line. You may have heard of Western Union. They're still a company. In fact, just the other day, I used Western Union to wire money electronically to Kenya. I have a friend there who's starting a school, like a school for adults to go through, like Bible education, and they needed funds for a table. They have a school, they don't even have a table. So I wired money to my friend there, and it was Western Union. And I texted him. I said, hey, I sent $50 Western Union. They received and they got it this morning. So Western Union's still a company, still a thing. And they were the company that famously helped build this transcontinental line. And this line, they started off, one side in California and one side across the Great Plains, and they met in the middle. Going across the Great Plains was a lot easier. It's flat. They were worried about, what's going to happen if buffalo are going to knock down the lines, and are Native Americans going to raid us as we're doing it? But very quickly, they got a rhythm and they moved across the Great Plains. Those coming from California had a little bit more of a difficult time because there was terrain, there's mountains that they have to deal with. There's elevation changes that they had to deal with. But it says on the handout that this transcontinental line would meet in the middle, one going from the east, coming from the east, one coming from the west. They would meet in the middle in 1861 in Salt Lake City, Utah. That's where they would meet in the middle, in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so Utah is kind of interesting and important because we haven't talked about this yet, but we also build a transcontinental railroad, and the Transcontinental Railroad is also going to move from the east, moving to the west. They're going to also be in California, moving, and Utah is also the place where they meet. So Utah, this kind of interesting, different part of the world in the 1800s, it's this Mormon majority place. Like 90%, 95% of all the people living in Utah are a very different religious background. They're Mormons. They have beliefs that were very unusual for the time, but yet, and they actually moved to Utah trying to get away from the rest of the United States. They went to Utah when Utah was actually a part of Mexico. It was the northern part of Mexico where really no Mexican official would ever go and ever be. And they didn't quite know and realize that going to Utah would not be a place where they would be on their own, because Utah would become part of the United States, because the United States would fight a war with Mexico and very quickly defeat Mexico and get all of modern day Colorado and Utah and Nevada and California and New Mexico and Arizona. All of that would be the United States. And so as the Mormons ran away to Utah to kind of get away and be on their own, now all of a sudden they found themselves in the middle of America, and in a very important part of America, because Americans wanted to connect the eastern part of the United States with the western part, especially after 1849, when we discover gold in California. There's an NFL team, the San Francisco 49ers. The reason they're called the 49ers is because it was in 1849 that we discovered gold in in California, and all the people moving across the Great Plains, moving across places like Utah, were these so-called 49ers. And so Utah is so important. It was right there in Salt Lake City that the line was connected. By 1880, of all the messages sent in the United States, of all the telegraph messages sent, Western Union carried 90% of the messages. So think about the power that this company, this corporation has. 90% of all text messages, of all telegraph messages sent by Western Union. How much did it cost? When we think about, or your parents think about their first cell phones and their first data plans, we're looking at a time where people are paying X amount of cents per text message. Well, how much did it cost to send a telegraph? Well, it says customers paid for the first 7 words $6. For the first 7 words, you would actually pay $6 for the first 7 words. And for each additional word, you would pay 45 cents. Now, to translate that into modern US value, like how much was that? What's the equivalent of that in today's money? Well, it was actually ridiculously expensive. And you were probably being overcharged, because it turned out that it was actually way cheaper to build this network communication than Western Union thought. They actually finished it quicker than they thought. They actually finished it under budget. But Western Union overcharged people originally. How much would that be in today's money? It says on your handout, today that would cost, if you wanted to send the message, quote, all of us customers are being badly overcharged. If you wanted to telegraph that out, how much would that message cost? We'll write down about $150. That's how much that simple message, all of us customers are being badly overcharged, it would cost about $150 to telegraph that message out. So Western Union is making a killing. They're making so much money with the telegraph. But this form of communication, that's millions of times faster, you're literally communicating at the speed of light, is so popular. It's so new. It's so efficient that people are, companies are, individuals are willing to put that money down to pay the price to communicate instantly, hundreds of miles away, or in some instances, thousands of miles away. Instant communication, it says on our handout, helped businesses grow. Instant communication helped businesses grow. And we see the same thing now. In the middle of pandemic, I can communicate with Chipotle, with Chick-fil-A, with various different places, and I can make an order at Starbucks. I can place an order on my cell phone at Starbucks and have them deliver, or go pick up something, or whatever the case may be, and it's going to be right there. I can walk in Chipotle right now. There's going to, or when we could go into these places, I could just go and pick up, grab and go, instantly ordered. And this is not a new thing. Businesses are growing through this instant communication at this time. It says now you could know up-to-date information on prices or demand thousands of miles away. Thousands of miles away, that, if I am growing corn, or I'm raising cattle, I can know, well, how many am I going to send to market? The demand is X, Y, or Z. How much am I going to be willing to sell? Well, it turns out that people in Chicago have a great demand. There's a great desire. Well, if there's a great demand, a great desire, I'm going to charge higher prices. Whatever the case may be, people are now communicating with one another. And this is going to involve, and this is going to inform international business, even for people who are thousands of miles away. This could help you decide what you would grow. It would help you decide, what are you going to grow when you're learning about the demands that other people have, when you're learning about the goods that people want. It's going to help you decide what it is that you'll grow, and it help you, secondly, to decide how much to charge. If there's a huge demand for something and there's just not enough of it, you're going to charge more. If there is not a huge demand for something and there's a bunch of it, it's just really prevalent, you're going to charge less. The telegraph helped all these decisions be made. In fact, it says on the handout, how fast information moved helped you to really adapt and figure out what it is that you were going to charge. It says information moved about 670 miles per hour. 670 miles per hour. That's the actual speed that stuff was traveling. I'm sending this stuff at 670 million miles per hour as soon as I use that telegraph. And that meant that investors could make decisions based on instant information. They could now make decisions based on instant information. I'm getting stuff from all around the world. I'm being able to respond all around the world to make these decisions with instant information. This is going to help the business world incredibly. It says that investors could make decisions about an international market, that they are now going to be deciding how much I'm going to charge, how much I'm going to sell, based on an international market. I'm going to raise cattle in Texas. I'm going to move it to Chicago. from Chicago. They're going to, slaughter them in Chicago. They're going to can meat and they're going to sell it to New York City. They're going to sell it to Philadelphia. There is now an international market, and the telegraph is going to help make all this possible. The telegraph would help create the modern Western economy, the economy that we have today, that is connecting the entire planet from India to Japan to Africa to New York City to Houston. This international market we have today is created by the telegraph. Going back to that first message, this first message we have that is sent is the message, what hath God wrought? And like so many things in American history, this is actually a reference to the Bible. It's a reference to a story found in the book of Numbers, chapter 23. And in this book of the Bible, it turns out that the Jews are moving into the promised land. That you might remember the basic story of the Bible, that the Jews leave slavery in Egypt and they go to a promised land, and there's people already living in that promised land. And so there's conflict that happens between the Jews and these new inhabitants. And there's this one king who really encourages one of his advisors, one of his leaders, to curse the Jewish people. He doesn't want the Jews to be successful. He doesn't want the Jews to take over the land. And this one man, he says that it's actually impossible for you to meaningfully curse the Jews as a people. Something that you can't do, because God has chosen the Jews for a reason, and God has chosen the Jews for a purpose. And the Jews might have some setbacks from time to time, but the Jews have been set on a course by God himself. And because the Jews are sent on a course by God himself, there's nothing you and I can do to stop that. It says on the handout that this first telegraph message was a reference to the chosen status of the Jews. It says that people would be powerless to change his destiny for them, that God had decided that the Jews were his chosen people. And it doesn't matter if you curse the Jews. It doesn't matter if you try to kill the Jews or to discriminate against the Jews. None of that's going to change that they are God's chosen people. In fact, it says that the world, on your handout, the world will stand in wonder. And here's the reference to the Bible. Here's what the Bible verse says. It shall be said of Jacob and Israel. These are the founding fathers of the Jewish people. It shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what hath God wrought? And woe to any who oppose them. In other words, this Bible verse is saying the whole world is going to look at the Jewish people and say, wow, look what God has done. And it's impossible for any man to stop what God has put into motion through the Jewish people, because they are his chosen people. Well, Morse, the guy who makes Morse code, Samuel Morse, his dad was a pastor. And his dad was a Bible teacher. And so Samuel Morse would have grown up hearing from the Bible stories like this. And so Samuel Morse has these two different ideas. They're going to come together, and not just for him, but for so many different Americans, of the Bible influencing the way he thought, and American exceptionalism influencing the way he thought. And so he thought, just like God had chosen the Jews for a time, God has now chosen in a different way, a different people. God has chosen the American people for a time. And just like God has a destiny for the Jews, and there's no one who can stop that destiny, there's no one who can change that destiny, guess what? God has chosen America as well with a destiny. And you probably know what this idea is called, this idea that we are meant, God has intended us to go from the eastern coast to the western coast. And it doesn't matter. The British can't keep us from this destiny. The Republic of Mexico cannot keep us from this destiny. Native Americans fighting for their land cannot keep us from this destiny. This is called manifest destiny, right? You've heard about this before. This phrase, what hath God wrought, was meant to tie in America to our own sense of manifest destiny. This was meant to tie America to our own sense of manifest destiny, just like God had a destiny for the Jews. And just like the whole world could try to stop the Jewish people or suppress the Jewish people, wipe out the Jewish people, the Bible story would imply that it's impossible for you to stop what God has meant for the Jews. And in the same way, Samuel Morse, all the Americans at this time were saying it's also impossible for anyone, the British Empire, Native Americans, to stop what God has destined for the American people. And he's also saying, by using this as the message to telegraph out, that technology is going to make it possible for us to conquer the West. Now, we're not just going to communicate with the West. We're not going to just communicate, but we're going to conquer the West partly through technology. The telegraph, it says on your handout, would help America expand, communicate, and conquer the West. The telegraph would help America expand, communicate, and conquer the West. I'm going to give you an example of how the telegraph can help us conquer the West. When I think of conquering the West, you probably think about cowboys and Indians, probably think about the US military. But I want to also tell you that this revolution of communication is what helped conquer the West become a reality. That as much as it is bullets that conquer the West, as much as it is American forces that conquer the West, as much as it is cowboys, I also want to encourage you to think that it's also these cables, these physical lines that help conquer the West. How is it that the telegraph can help conquer the West? I mean, how can electronic pulses across lines help conquer the West? Well, there's a map on your handout, and this is a very famous image, a famous map of a Native American group that was in conflict with the United States. This picture, this image on your handout was called the Nez Perce Retreat, the Nez Perce Retreat of 1877. So it turns out that the Nez Perce are one of the last Native American groups to be in conflict with the United States. They want their freedom, they want their independence, and the United States has a very different vision for Native Americans. We in the United States, we want to put Native Americans on reservations. We don't want them to be these nomadic, these semi-nomadic people moving around with their animals. And we come into conflict with the Nez Perce people, and their strategy is, listen, if we cannot defeat the United States military, we're just going to leave. In fact, if we are based in modern day Idaho, modern day Washington, modern day Oregon, we're going to go as quickly as we can to Canada. That's their goal. In fact, this handout, this little red line, it shows you that they go from Oregon to Idaho through Montana, trying to escape, trying to keep away from the American army through very difficult terrain, some of it. But their escape to Canada is going to come short from making it. In fact, you'll see that on the picture on that map, they get close, but they never quite make it. It says on your handout that these were Native Americans in conflict with the United States forces, and they tried to flee to Canada. They tried to flee to Canada, which was a distance of some 1,500 miles. That's how far that they ran away from the United States, 1,500 miles. They just want freedom. They just want their independence. They want to live their own lives. They want their future to be defined not by Washington, D.C., but by the same way of life that they had enjoyed for so long before white Americans came onto the scene. They decide to flee to Canada 1,500 miles away, but they were caught. They were stopped, we'll write down, only 40 miles from the border. They were 40 miles from freedom. What was it that stopped these people? I mean, How is it that they traveled 1,500 miles but were stopped from freedom 40 miles from the Canadian border? We'll write down that they were tracked down because of the telegraph. Everywhere these Native Americans went and everywhere they fled, people would report sightings of them. They'd say, oh, we saw them at Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone was the first national park for our country. In fact, the first national park in global history. There was never another example of thousands of miles of land set apart as a park until Yellowstone was the first national park in world history. The Native Americans went through Yellowstone everywhere that they went, and people had sightings of them. People would telegraph, this is where they're at, this is where they're heading, this is where they're going. And so even though the Native Americans had superior knowledge of the land, the wires, these copper wires, these telegraph cables are what allowed the American army to keep in step with them and make sure that despite that they would go 1,500 miles, they would never make those last 40 miles to freedom. The telegraph gave us, the United States, a military edge that Native Americans could not compete with. Faster than any horse could go, faster than any man could travel, millions of miles an hour, we're sending telegraph information, updating the U.S. Army of where they're going. They were stopped. It says on a handout that steam, here's a quotation, steam and electricity plus the American spirit had created the greatest and the most original, the most wonderful country the sun has ever shone upon, wrote a New York City editorialist musing on the telegraph and its meaning. With such powers, America's sweep to continental dominance was unstoppable, he added, and any who stood in the way and failed to mix with this movement will be crushed into impalpable powder. And so people were thinking about the role of the telegraph, and they said that, listen, technology has allowed a continuation of a destiny for America that no one could stop. Not the most powerful British army could stop our destiny. Not the bravery of Native Americans on the Great Plains or the American West could stop our destiny. In fact, the very last thing on this story of the Nez Perce retreat, who were informed, their movements were informed by the telegraph, was how were they, who physically caught them? It says that they were stopped by American soldiers brought by trains all the way from Georgia. Here we are in Montana, 40 miles from the Canadian border, and the soldiers who stopped them were brought by train all the way from Georgia. So we have these two pieces of 19th century technology, the wire, these copper wires, telegraph, a communication revolution. We have train, rail, the steam engine, a revolution in transportation. These two things, a revolution of communication, a revolution of transportation, came together and 40 miles from the Canadian border stopped the last Native American group in major resistance to our vision of manifest destiny. Samuel Morse probably could not have imagined that what he telegraphed out, what hath God wrought, would have concluded with America transforming the American West in the image that the American government wanted. The Native Americans would be defeated. They'd be forced on these reservations. And as much as they were forced on reservation by American bullets and American men, it was thousands of miles of train tracks and thousands of miles of telegraph wire that made that possible. And so as we finish our time today, we think about how the telegraph changed American, and not just American, but world history. It tied the world together. And really, America is going to go from a regional power, a power that's okay in the Western Hemisphere, to a power that is more and more flexing its muscles and going to be able to even take the stage to stand alongside countries like Britain and France, and even able in the 20th century to challenge rising powers like Germany. I look forward to seeing you next time as we continue to talk about the role of the Industrial Revolution. Until then, be safe.